A judge insults Pam Bondi in open court. Minutes later, she has him in handcuffs. You won't believe what happened next. Pam Bondi wasn't new to pressure. She had spent years in the legal trenches, taking on some of the toughest cases in the country. But today felt different. As she stepped into the courtroom of Judge Howard Gates, a man infamous for his sharp tongue and unpredictable rulings, she knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary hearing. The case at hand, a high-stakes government ethics violation that had the potential to shake up more than just a few careers. The defendant was a wealthy developer with deep political ties, accused of funneling state funds into his private projects. The evidence was stacked high, and Bondi had come prepared. What she hadn't prepared for was the hostility radiating from the bench. Before she even spoke a word, Judge Gates barely looked up as she approached the plaintiff's table. Instead, he flipped through a file with deliberate slowness, letting the courtroom sit in silence. The kind of silence that wasn't just procedural. It was designed to make a statement. Finally, without looking at her, he spoke. Miss Bondi, I assume you've prepared something of substance today? Or should we just skip ahead to the part where you waste my time? A few chuckles rippled through the back of the courtroom, mostly from the defendant's legal team. Bondi ignored them. She had faced worse. Your Honor, I believe the evidence will speak for itself. This case involves the misuse of taxpayer dollars, and my job is to ensure the facts are presented accurately. Judge Gates leaned back in his chair, feigning boredom. Taxpayer dollars, right? Because that's never been the foundation of a frivolous case before. Bondi's jaw tightened, but she kept her tone steady. Respectfully, Your Honor, I would hardly call felony corruption charges frivolous. For a brief moment, their eyes met, his cold and calculating, hers unwavering. But before she could continue, he cut her off again. Mrs. Bondi, spare me the lectures. Just get to the point. I don't have all day to entertain whatever grandstanding you have planned. A murmur spread through the gallery. The courtroom wasn't packed, but those present were alert, sensing something was off. Judges could be tough, but this was personal. Pam took a slow breath, recalibrating. She knew what was happening. Gates wanted her off balance. He wanted to control the tempo, to put her on the defensive. But she wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. She picked up a folder from the table, flipping it open. Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit A. These financial records clearly demonstrate— Ms. Bondi, Gates interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Do you always insist on drowning people in paperwork? Or is this just your way of compensating? That one landed. The shift in the room was instant. The defense attorney smirked. A few reporters in the gallery exchanged glances. But Bondi didn't flinch. She had learned a long time ago that men like Judge Gates thrived on intimidation. The only way to beat them was to never let them see you rattle. She paused just long enough to make a statement without saying a word. Then she set the folder down and clasped her hands together. Your Honor, if you prefer to continue making this personal, I'm happy to request a recess while we address any professional concerns you may have. It was subtle, not aggressive, not disrespectful, but pointed, a clear warning that she wasn't going to roll over. The judge's lips curled slightly. Was that amusement? Annoyance? It was hard to tell. But he wasn't done. Not yet. Oh, I don't have concerns, Ms. Bondi. I just know a weak case when I see one. This time, the reaction wasn't just murmurs. A few gasps. Someone whispered something under their breath. This wasn't how a judge was supposed to conduct a hearing. Pam could feel the weight of the room shifting, eyes moving between her and Gates like a tennis match. But she wasn't going to engage in a shouting match. That's what he wanted. Instead, she adjusted her blazer, straightened a few papers, and looked him dead in the eye. Then I suppose we should let the evidence do the talking. But as she spoke, she caught something in his expression. Not just arrogance, not just condescension. There was something else, a flicker of something deeper, like a man who had a stake in the outcome of this case. And that's when she knew. This wasn't just about courtroom theatrics. Judge Gates wasn't just being combative for sport. He had something to hide. But what he didn't know, so did she. Pam Bondi had been in plenty of tense hearings before, but this was something else. Judge Gates wasn't just ruling from the bench. He was playing a game, a calculated, deliberate attempt to undermine her in front of the entire courtroom. But why? She could feel the weight of his stare as she moved through her arguments. Every word she spoke, he was waiting to pounce. She could practically see it, the slight curl of his lips, the slow tap of his fingers on the bench, as if he was daring her to keep going. She wasn't about to stop. "Your Honor," she said, keeping her tone measured, "these documents show a clear discrepancy in the funding allocations. The defendant's company received nearly triple the amount approved in the original budget, and none of it was accounted for in the state records." She turned slightly, gesturing toward the projection screen where the financial statements were displayed. "Now, if you look here, Miss Bondi," Gates cut in, his voice carrying that same smug edge. "I hate to interrupt your presentation. Really, I do. But I think we've seen enough numbers for one day." Bondi glanced at him, then back at the screen. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. "Your Honor, with all due respect, these numbers are the foundation of the case." "Right," he scoffed. "And yet, I fail to see anything that justifies wasting the court's time like this." There it was, that word again. Wasting time. He was trying to bury this case before it even got off the ground. She heard a soft rustle behind her, the sound of the prosecution team shifting, exchanging looks. They felt it too. Something wasn't right. Bondi tightened her grip on her pen, flipping to the next page in her file. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit a motion to—" "Denied." Silence. She looked up. "I haven't even stated the motion yet." "And yet," Gates leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, "I can already tell you it's going nowhere. Let's be honest, Miss Bondi. This entire case is built on speculation, a little creative accounting, and suddenly you're crying corruption." The defense attorney, a middle-aged man in a navy suit, smirked. He hadn't had to say a word. Gates was doing all the work for him. Bondi exhaled slowly. "Your Honor, are you refusing to allow my motion before hearing its contents?" A pause, a beat too long. "I'm refusing to indulge this circus act any longer." The courtroom wasn't just tense now. It was shifting, eyes darting, heads turning. Even the reporters in the back were scribbling faster. Bondi caught the glance of one of the jurors, a woman in her 50s wearing a dark blazer. The woman's brows furrowed, lips pressed together. She wasn't the only one taking notice. The problem with arrogance? It makes people pay attention. Bondi squared her shoulders. "Very well, Your Honor. Then let's proceed with the next piece of evidence." She turned back to the screen, clicking to the next slide. "This document, obtained through a subpoena, shows that—" "Ms. Bondi." The tone was different this time. A shift. She stopped, looked at him. Judge Gates was no longer leaning back in his chair. No longer wearing that smug expression. His hands were clasped now, his mouth a thin, hard line. Something had changed. "Approach the bench." It wasn't a request. She hesitated, then set her papers down and walked toward him. The courtroom hushed. When she reached the bench, he lowered his voice just enough so only she could hear. "I'd strongly suggest you reconsider the direction you're taking here, Miss Bondi." She tilted her head slightly. "Excuse me. I'm saying," he murmured, "that some fights aren't worth having." She let that sit in the air between them. Then slowly, deliberately, she leaned in just an inch closer. "I don't scare easily, Judge Gates." A muscle in his jaw twitched. She turned and walked back to her table. But that moment told her everything she needed to know. Pam Bondi returned to her seat, her mind racing. That wasn't just a power move. That was a warning, a veiled threat disguised as judicial authority. But why? She had walked into this courtroom expecting pushback, maybe even hostility. But this was something deeper. Judge Gates wasn't just biased. He was protecting something, or someone. She adjusted a stack of papers, keeping her expression neutral. The prosecution team beside her shifted, waiting for her to react. She didn't. Not yet. Instead, she lifted her chin and faced the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to continue presenting my evidence." Gates didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence linger, as if deciding how far he wanted to push. Then finally, "Proceed. But keep it brief." Bondi didn't acknowledge the jab. She simply reached for the next file. This document is a contract signed between the defendant and the city's planning board, outlining the proposed project expenses. You'll notice that the listed cost totals just over $2 million. She paused, then, with deliberate precision, she placed another sheet on the projector. However, this is an internal ledger from the defendant's company, showing that the actual funds transferred were nearly double that amount. And here, she placed a third document down. And this is the approval signature, signed off by. She hesitated, letting the weight of the moment land. Judge Howard Gates. The courtroom didn't just shift, it cracked, a ripple of movement. Eyes darting, pen scratching. The defense attorney stiffened, his smug expression wiped clean. Judge Gates. He didn't move. For the first time since she had stepped into this courtroom, his face was unreadable. Bondi let the silence hang for a moment longer, then continued. Your Honor, would you like to explain why your signature appears on an unauthorized financial transaction involving the defendant? A calculated risk. She didn't have the full story yet, but what she did have was enough to shake the foundation beneath him. Gates finally moved, shifting slightly in his seat, his fingers pressed together, knuckles whitening. That document, he said slowly, is inadmissible. Bondi tilted her head. How so? It was obtained improperly. She let that sink in. Your Honor, this document was subpoenaed by my office. His nostrils flared. Then it was mishandled. I'm ruling it inadmissible. It will not be considered by this court. This time the shift wasn't just in the gallery. It was everywhere. The jury, the stenographer, even the bailiff. Everyone was watching. Bondi crossed her arms, her tone calm. You do realize this is a public hearing, correct? That the media is here? That every single person in this room just saw you declare critical financial evidence inadmissible, without reason? A muscle in his jaw jumped. That's enough, Miss Bondi. She didn't move, didn't blink. Then slowly she sat down. And that's when she did something that changed everything. She reached into her case and pulled out a small recorder. She placed it on the table and pressed play. A voice filled the courtroom, low, gruff, unmistakable. Take care of it. I don't care how. The recording crackled, then continued. Make sure she doesn't get her hands on those ledgers. Silence. Absolute suffocating silence. Judge Gates didn't move, didn't breathe. Bondi didn't look at him. She didn't need to, because now every single person in this room had heard him, and the real game was about to begin.